September 15th, 1600. Dawn breaks over the mountains of central Japan. In the valley of Sekigahara, a thick blanket of morning fog clings to the slopes, muffling sound and making the world seem unnaturally still. Yet, the air feels different today. As the mist begins to lift, two vast armies drawn up among the mountains slowly reveal themselves. Their numbers are staggering, their ranks packed tighter than any seen before. Here, one of the largest clashes in the history of the Sengoku period is about to begin. Here is Sekigahara. On this first year of the 17th century, in the rugged hills here, over 170,000 men will take the field, setting a new record for the age. This will be a battle that changes Japan forever. At Sekigahara, the tide will turn away from another age of division and toward a new era of unity. The victor, Tokugawa Ieyasu, will forge a shogunate that will rule for more than 260 years. But, like so many wars of the Sengoku, this battle will be steeped in intrigue, betrayal, and loyalty tested to its limits.
Turn the clock back 10 years before the battle. For more than a century, since 1467, Japan had been torn apart by the chaos and bloodshed of the Sengoku, the age of the country at war. At last, through the brilliance and relentless will of a man born not to nobility, but to humble origins, a peasant son turned samurai, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Japan's long nightmare drew to a close. The final warlord to defy unification, the mighty Hojo clan, was crushed. For the first time in over 120 years, the Japanese archipelago was whole once more. Hideyoshi commanded Japan's most formidable army and ruled from the prosperous heartland of Osaka. Under the weight of his military might, all other daimyo are forced to bow, even if their loyalty was reluctant. Among them, one figure who will stand at the center of our story, Tokugawa Ieyasu. But Hideyoshi's rule was never as secure as it appeared. Japan was not like the broad, connected plains of Europe. It was a narrow island chain, more than 80% of it rugged mountains. Only scattered pockets of farmland lay in valleys and coastal plains. In the Sengoku age, the few roads that linked east and west could be blocked by a handful of warriors holding a mountain pass. With such geography and such scattered, isolated populations, Japan was a land where regional warlords could easily carve out their own realms. Complete and lasting unity had always been elusive. Hideyoshi was no exception. Though he achieved political unification, he could not erase the reality. The daimyo still ruled their own domains like kings. They kept their own armies, wielded absolute power in their territories, and owed Hideyoshi only as much loyalty as his strength could command. Tokugawa Ieyasu was a prime example. Ruling the rich lands around Edo, he commanded tens of thousands of warriors, his power second only to Hideyoshi's. In fact, his territory, on the map, was larger than Hideyoshi's own, though Osaka's commercial wealth made Hideyoshi the richer of the two. The daimyo's allegiance, then, was never born of devotion.
It was born of fear. Fear of Toyotomi Hideyoshi while he lived.
In 1598, everything changed. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was dead, aged 61. He left behind only a child, Toyotomi Hideyori, just 3 years old, and his mother, Lady Yodo. Neither had the power or the experience to withstand the storm that was coming.
Least of all from Tokugawa Ieyasu. Now, he was the highest-ranking official in the Toyotomi administration, formally entrusted with governing Japan until Hideyori came of age. It was a safeguard meant to protect the boy. In truth, Hideyoshi had planted the seeds of his son's undoing. Ieyasu would not waste such an opportunity. He began to move swiftly, quietly drawing other daimyo into his orbit, demanding their loyalty, and laying the groundwork for a new regime that would sweep away the Toyotomi once and for all. Many answered his call, for Ieyasu was not only the most powerful daimyo in Japan, his land stretching wider than any other, and his military record spoke for itself. He was one of the few commanders to have beaten Hideyoshi on the open battlefield at the Battle of Komaki, Nagakute in 1584. To many daimyo, Ieyasu looked like the man who could deliver the next great victory and the next great rewards. For Hideyori and Lady Yodo, there was little they could do. But Ieyasu's growing dominance alarmed others. Opposition began to gather, led by one of Hideyoshi's most loyal former retainers, Ishida Mitsunari. Mitsunari's fief was small, his rank bugyo, below Ieyasu's. Yet his loyalty to the Toyotomi cause burned fiercely. Where did that loyalty come from? And could it be enough to stand against Tokugawa Ieyasu? As a boy, Ishida Mitsunari was no warrior. He was a temple acolyte, destined for a quiet life of study and devotion, until fate intervened. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, then Japan's rising unifier, encountered the youth by chance and saw potential. He took Mitsunari into his service, raised him from obscurity, and made him a close personal attendant. From there, Mitsunari rose swiftly, granted his own fief, his own castle, and the title of daimyo. Hideyoshi trusted him completely, and, on his deathbed, entrusted Mitsunari with the care of his young son, Toyotomi Hideyori. Mitsunari swore an oath to protect the boy, an oath that now bound his every decision. With Tokugawa Ieyasu's ambitions growing ever more obvious, Mitsunari resolved to act. The war, he sensed, could no longer be avoided. But to face Ieyasu alone would be hopeless, so he sought allies. Through persuasion and appeals to loyalty, Mitsunari drew to his side daimyo still faithful to the Toyotomi cause, or resentful of Ieyasu's growing power. Among them were some of the most powerful lords in Japan: Mori Terumoto, Ukita Hideye, Uesugi Kagekatsu. Together, their combined might rivaled that of Ieyasu and his allies. Now geography sharpened the divide. Ieyasu's own territories, and those of his supporters, lay mostly in the east. Mitsunari's allies held sway in the west. Japan was sliding once more toward fracture, east against west, in a looming struggle for supremacy. The crisis reached its tipping point in April 1600. Uesugi Kagekatsu, one of Mitsunari's key allies, was accused of plotting rebellion. In June, Ieyasu ordered his supporters across Japan to march against the Uesugi. From all corners, Ieyasu's allies converged on his stronghold at Edo. With his own retainers, the army swelled to 90,000 men, one of the largest forces ever assembled in the Sengoku era. At this point, Tokugawa Ieyasu still officially served as regent for Toyotomi Hideyori. He had not yet declared himself an enemy of the Toyotomi. He still resided in Osaka, the very heart of Toyotomi power. On July 2nd, Tokugawa Ieyasu reached his home territories, linking up with the allies who had been waiting for him. His plan was simple: rest his men briefly, then march northeast to strike a Uesugi Kagekatsu, who had already spent a month fortifying his lands in preparation. But behind Ieyasu, a storm was gathering. On July 1st, Ukita Hideye, one of the most powerful members of the anti-Tokugawa coalition, suddenly declared war. It was the result of talks with Ishida Mitsunari. In the following days, the declarations came in quick succession. Mori Terumoto, Kobayakawa Hideaki, Chozokabe Morichika, Otani Yoshitsugu, Shimazu Yoshihiro, and of course, Ishida himself. By July 17th, the alliance against Totowa Ieyasu was complete. Mitsunari would not stand by and watch his ally Uesugi Kagekatsu be destroyed. He moved to act. The anti-Tokugawa coalition drew its strength mainly from Western Japan, and so it became known as the Western Army. Ieyasu's forces, with their territories and allies concentrated in the east, were called the Eastern Army.
roughly divided along the provinces of Owari and Mino. Each side could call on immense strength. The Western Army's mobile field forces numbered around 90,000. The Eastern Army, nearly the same. A confrontation on a scale never before seen in Japan's history was about to begin. Yet the reality was more complicated than a simple east-west divide. Near Osaka, at Fushimi Castle, a mere 2,000 men under Tori Mototada, loyal to Ieyasu, held their ground. In the Tango region, other eastern-aligned daimyo commanded several thousand troops. Far to the east, Uesugi Kagekatsu's 20,000 men stood intact, but were pinned down by the forces of Mogami Yoshiaki, an Ieyasu ally with comparable numbers, preventing them from aiding the Western Army. On Kyushu and Shikoku, the balance of power was just as even, daimyo loyal to both sides, clashing in local battles, even as the Greater War loomed. Now, both Tokugawa Ieyasu and Ashita Mitsunari faced the same urgent question. Should they strike or should they defend? And most importantly, where would the decisive battle be fought? First, Tokugawa Ieyasu's plan. He would take the offensive. The numbers on each side may have been roughly equal, but Ieyasu had every confidence in the fighting quality of his men. He himself was a veteran of countless campaigns, and many of his allies, daimyo like Ikeda Teurumasa, Fukushima Masanori, and Kuroda Nagamasa, had fought in Hideyoshi's invasions of Korea and excelled at aggressive, offensive warfare. For Ieyasu, attack was the natural choice. As for his objectives, Ieyasu had little interest in the far-off northeast, where Uesugi Kagekatsu was already pinned down by Mogami Yoshiaki. The clashes on Shikoku and Kyushu mattered even less.
Instead, he would concentrate all his strength to the west, smash the opposition in Osaka, the political heart of the Toyotomi regime. On the western side, the situation was more complicated. Nominally, overall command belonged to Mori Teramoto, the most powerful daimyo in the alliance. But the driving force behind the war effort, the man making the real decisions, was Ishida Mitsunari. His problem was clear. Although the Western Army's numbers were impressive, many of its members had been persuaded to join only at the last moment. Mitsunari knew their will to fight might not match that of Ieyasu's seasoned followers. Some of his own allies, like Konishi Yukinaga and Ukida Hideye, had fought in Korea, but they were not famed for offensive skill. So Mitsunari would fight defensively. That left the question, where could he block Ieyasu's advance? Japan's mountainous terrain gave him one advantage. Between Edo and the central provinces, there were only two main routes, one the coastal Tokaido, the other the inland mountain road, the Nakasendo. Which would Ieyasu choose? Ieyasu's response was as follows. His core army, mainly his own retainers, could march along Nakasendo Road, advance quickly without serious fighting. Meanwhile, a second army, drawn from his other supporters, would march along the Tokaido Road. Their task? To strike into Mino and clear the path ahead. The two forces would then unite in Mino, seize its most important city, Gifu, and make it their new forward base. From there, they would push along the shorter inland road, Nakasendo again, straight to Osaka. When Mitsunari learned of Ieyasu's plan, he moved quickly. If the Eastern Army was coming through Mino, that was where he would stop them. By mid-July, the Western Army was on the march. Ishida Mitsunari's first line of defense would be Gifu Castle, held by his ally Oda Hidenobu. Now, it stood under threat from two converging Tokugawa armies. But from mid-July to early August, Mitsunari was delayed. He spent 2 precious weeks mopping up the last pockets of Tokugawa resistance at Fushimi Castle and persuading more daimyo to join his cause. Gifu Castle received no reinforcements. On August 24th, after holding out for just a single day, the vast fortress fell to Ieyasu's forces. The ease of the victory was a grim warning. The Eastern Army was as formidable an attack as its commander claimed. By early September, Mitsunari's army had only just crossed the Nakasendo into Mino province. Ieyasu now held Gifu Castle, and both of his armies had joined forces. Mitsunari had no more room to maneuver. He would make his stand at Sekigahara. Sekigahara was a vital gateway between Mino and Omi provinces, where the Nakasendo and Hokurikudo roads met. Surrounded by mountains, the narrow valley was ideal for defense. If the Western Army could not hold here, then the plains beyond Lake Biwa offer little hope of stopping Ieyasu. Mitsunari began to deploy his troops. On the north flank, atop the heights of Mount Saso, he positioned 8,000 of his own men, anchoring the army's extreme left. Next came 2,000 troops of the Toyotomi heir, Hideyori, under Mitsunari's direct command. Beside them, Shimazu Yoshihiro with 1,500 warriors. On Mount Tenman, Konishi Yokinaga held 6,000 men, with Ukita Hidei commanding the largest single force in the Western Army, 17,000 strong, deployed just to the south. Guarding the Nakasendo itself was Mitsunari's close friend, Otani Yoshisugu, with 6,000 men. Further south stood the low slopes of Mount Matsuo, less than 300 meters high, where Kobayakawa Hideaki commanded 15,000 troops. Kobayakawa Hideaki, adopted son of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, was a trusted young daimyo of considerable power. In front of his position stood the combined 4,200 men of Ogawa Suketada, Wakisaka Yasuharu, Akaza Nayasu, and Kuchiki Motosuna. Kobayakawa's place on the far right was no less critical than Mitsunari's on the far left. If either flank was taken, the Western Army's position would collapse. Mitsunari counted on Hideyoshi's adopted son to hold firm in the decisive moment. 6 kilometers to the southeast in the heights of Mount Nangu sat the Western Army's nominal commander, Mori Terimoto's contingent, 15,000 strong, joined by Chosokabe Morichika, Kikawa Hiroi, and others, bringing the total to 30,000. Their position was carefully chosen, 500 meters above the valley, far enough from the main line to avoid encirclement, yet close enough that if Ieyasu ignored them and pushed into Sekigahara, the Eastern Army's rear would be dangerously exposed. By the eve of battle, the Western Army's deployment was complete, 87,700 men in the field, an army worthy of deciding the fate of Japan. From Gifu Castle, Tokugawa Ieyasu now pressed forward. On September 14th, he reached the mouth of the Sekigahara Pass. Detailed reconnaissance had already revealed the Western Army's dispositions. Ieyasu ignored the formidable position of Mori forces on Mount Nangu and advanced straight through the valley. By the following day, he was on the open plain at Sekigahara, where he began to deploy his army. He divided his forces into 3 groups. The vanguard held the front line. On the southern flank, Fukushima Masanori with 6,000 men, flanked to his left by Tanaka Yoshimasa's 3,000. Then Kyogoku Takatsugu's 3,000, Teruzawa Hirotaka's 2,400, and Todo Takatora's 2,500. Kuroda Nagamasa brought 5,400, Hosokawa Tadeoki 5,000, Kato Yoshiaki 3,000, and Tsutsui Sadatsugu 2,850. Further behind stood Naomasa's Matsudaira Tadayoshi's 3,000 and the 6,000 men of Furuta Shigenari and other commanders. In all, the vanguard numbered 45,700 troops. 1 kilometer to the east, on Mount Momokui, Ieyasu commanded the main body, 30,000 men. A further kilometer back stood the rear guard, 14,000 troops, guarding against any move from the Mori on Mount Nangu. Here were Yamanosu Kazutoyo's 3,000, Asano Yukinaga's 6,510, and Ikeda Terumasa's 4,560. That day, the Eastern Army brought 89,700 men to the field, a very slight numerical edge. In reality, both sides had major contingents absent. Ieyasu's eldest son, Tokugawa Hidetada, was still on the Nakasendo with 30,000 men, delayed by the stubborn resistance of the Sanada clan in Shinada. At Osaka, Mori Terumoto's reserve of 30,000 remained idle. Neither force would arrive in time to fight. On paper, Sekigahara looked like an even match. Some even believed the Western Army had the better chance, capable of crushing Ieyasu in a pincer attack from front and rear. Centuries later, a Western military advisor studying the battle would make the same first impression. The Western Army should win. But the battle itself told a very different story. At around 8 a.m., as the morning fog finally lifted, the Eastern Army attacked. Fukushima Masanori struck first, launching a fierce assault on Ukita Hide's position. Kuroda Nagamasa and Hosokawa Tadaoki drove against Ishida Mitsunari's lines, while Todo Takatora and Kyogoku Takatsugu hammered Otani Yoshisugu's defenses. But the Western Army hit back hard. Fukushima Masanori was driven back nearly 500 meters. Mitsunari himself repelled his attackers, regaining ground. Here the Western Army fought with determination, their most steadfast daimyo holding firm. Yet on the western right flank, there was silence. Kobayakawa Hideaki's 15,000 men and 4,200 under Ogawa Tsukatada and his allies in front of him remained idle all morning. No attack came. No arrows flew. 6 kilometers away, on Mount Nangu, the same was true. The Maori army and Yamanouchi Kazutoyo's men stared at each other across the ridgeline and did nothing. Something was not right. By late morning, the Western Army's counterattacks were beginning to tell. Around 11 a.m., Ishida Mitsunari gave the signal. Columns of smoke rising into the sky, his order for an all-out assault to encircle and crush Tokugawa Ieyasu's army. But again, nothing. On the right flank, there was no movement. 6 kilometers away, the 30,000 men on Mount Nangu remained silent, cut off from communication. Mitsunari sent urgent messengers again and again. None returned with a reply. And then, movement. Kobayakawa Hideaki suddenly gave the order. His 15,000 men charged down Mount Matsuo, not against the enemy, but straight into the flank of their own allies. The truth was revealed. Kobayakawa Hideaki and Mori Terumoto had struck a bargain with Ieyasu long before the battle. Hideaki would turn his coat when the moment came. Terumoto, as nominal commander of the Western Army, would stand aside and do nothing until the fighting was over. The Western Army's 83,500 troops, more than half, were either loyal to the enemy or had already reached secret agreements. Mitsunari was now caught in a trap from which there was no escape. The tragedy unfolded swiftly. From the heights, Kobayakawa's men poured down in a furious assault. Otani Yoshitsugu's troops, holding the low ground, were taken completely by surprise. Then, the final blow. Ogawa Tsukatada and the other 4,200 men in front of Hideaki's lines also turned their coats, joining in the attack on their former comrades. It was a festival of betrayal. A few hours later, Otani's army broke.
In rage and despair, the gravely ill Yoshitsugu committed seppuku on the battlefield. Mitsunari had lost one of his closest friends. Only weeks before, Yoshitsugu had wavered between sides. But Mitsunari's personal appeal had convinced him to stand with the Western cause, to follow him onto the road of no return. By 1 p.m., news of Otani's death and the destruction of his army swept through Western lines. Morale collapsed. Konishi Yukinaga's and Ukita Hideyogi's troops fell into chaos and fled. Mitsunari's own force was surrounded and began to scatter. The Western army disintegrated in barely half a day. Only Shimazu Yoshihiro, with 1,500 men, managed to cut his way out, breaking southwest through the enemy lines. The uprising against Tokugawa Ieyasu had been utterly destroyed. That the Battle of Sekigahara, deciding the fate of Japan, should be over in a single day is almost incredible. The reason was plain. The Western army had no will to fight. Its ranks were riddled with hesitation, opportunism, and outright treachery. Kobayakawa Hideyaki's defection was the fatal blow. In a coalition held together only by convenience, loyalty was a fragile thing. The moment a greater prize was dangled before them, men betrayed their allies without a second thought. And so Tokugawa Ieyasu plucked the fruits of victory, almost without effort. When the battle ended, the Western army's daimyos, those who keep fighting, faced grim fates, captured, executed, or driven to suicide. The Western commanders who had stood their ground at Sekigahara met particularly tragic ends. Ishida Mitsunari, the true mastermind behind the Western cause, was captured after defeat. Tokugawa Ieyasu executed him alongside his eldest son. Mitsunari had given his life in loyalty to Toyotomi Hideyoshi, stepping up to defend his young lord's fragile legacy with everything he had. Otani Yoshitsugu, Mitsunari's close friend and convinced ally, took his own life on the battlefield. Konishi Yukinaga was also executed. Ukita Hidei was stripped of his lands and exiled. Uesugi Kagekatsu, the first daimyo to openly oppose Tokugawa Ieyasu, suffered severe territorial reductions as punishment. Elsewhere, rebellious lords across Japan faced varying degrees of retribution. Meanwhile, the greatest traitor of the day, Kobayakawa Hideaki, was handsomely rewarded. Ieyasu granted him a massive fief worth 500,000 koku. Yet, having betrayed his adoptive father, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Hideaki earned the scorn and ridicule of both East and West armies alike. This young man died only 2 years later, reportedly from illness, or some say from shame. The other traitors fared far worse. Mori Terimoto, the Western Army's nominal commander who sat idle throughout the battle, displeased Tokugawa with his inaction and suffered severe reductions to his own domain. Ogawa Suketada and others who changed side on battle received no rewards at all. Unaware of their betrayal until it happened, Ieyasu still punished them by confiscating their lands. Truly, they were a pitiful band of turncoats. The victor of Sekigahara, Tokugawa Ieyasu, had once again viewed such superior strategic genius and political acumen. With overwhelming military strength, a wide network of alliances, and ruthless pragmatism, his triumph was indisputable. Through this massive yet brief battle, Ieyasu crushed steadfast opponents like Ishida Mitsunari and Ukita Hidei, and significantly weakened rivals such as the Mori and Uesugi clans, securing his hold over Japan's highest power. 15 years later, in the siege of Osaka, Tokugawa would extinguish the Toyotomi clan's last flicker of authority, cementing his own shogunate and inaugurating over 260 years of Tokugawa rule. The Battle of Sekigahara reminds us that in the age of the samurai, loyalty was a rare and precious virtue. To protect the power, blind trust alone was never enough.
Thank you for watching today's story, and have a good day.